Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and really dig into the big ideas. Today we're tackling a major one, Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, the book from '62. But with all those later prefaces where he kind of reflects on things, you wanted to get under the hood, understand the core arguments, and maybe find some of the surprising bits. And we've got a good stack of excerpts here. Covers the link between economic and political freedom, government's role, money, trade, welfare, even discrimination. It's a lot. But yeah, the mission is to pull out the key stuff, see what this foundational text tells us about the world then and, well, now too.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting right off the bat is Friedman himself looking back. In that 2002 preface, he talks about this massive shift in opinion he saw between when the book first came out in '62 and the 1980s. And he argues it wasn't really theory that changed minds. It was, reality hitting home.
Like what specifically?
Well, the failures of central planning just became undeniable, he felt. And then you had the contrast with market economies really taking off. He mentions the East Asia tigers, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea as powerful examples, real-world evidence.
Okay. So he felt like events kind of proved his points, or at least supported them strongly.
Pretty much. So this deep dive, it's really looking at ideas he felt were, tested by time.
Got it. Okay, let's jump into that core idea then, the connection between economics and politics. He doesn't see them as separate boxes at all, does he?
Not at all. That's fundamental. He argues economic freedom isn't just like a nice side benefit. It's essential for political freedom, for civil liberty.
So you can't really have one without the other, in his view.
That's the strong claim. He directly challenges this idea of democratic socialism. He's basically saying, look, you can't just build on the kind of centralized economic planning you see in, say, Soviet Russia at the time, what he calls totalitarian socialism, and expect to keep your individual political freedoms intact.
Why not? What's the inherent conflict?
Because that kind of planning, it requires the state to control too much. Your job, what gets produced, prices. That concentration of economic power inevitably spills over, he thinks, restricting political dissent, freedom of speech, all of it.
He gives examples, right? I remember something about the UK after World War II.
The Control of Engagements Order. It was an attempt by the government to basically tell people where they had to work, allocate labor.
Sounds pretty extreme.
It was, and his point is, it clashed so fundamentally with British ideas of personal liberty that it was barely enforced and repealed very quickly.
Ah, so people just wouldn't stand for it.
Exactly. He saw that reaction as proof that trying to centrally control economic life runs smack into the desire for personal freedom.
Okay, so why does economic freedom support other freedoms? What's the mechanism?
It comes down to the market, voluntary exchange. His core idea is that when two people freely agree to a trade, they're both informed, they both expect to benefit.
Right, otherwise they wouldn't do it.
Precisely. And this voluntary cooperation, happening millions of times across society, coordinates economic activity without coercion. Nobody is forced.
And competitive capitalism is his model for that.
Yes, that's his ideal. Private enterprise, individuals making their own choices about buying, selling, working. Cooperation is voluntary.
Okay, this next bit is where it gets really thought-provoking. His example about advocating for change in a socialist society.
Right, the hypothetical. Imagine you want to promote capitalism in a country where the government controls everything. How do you even start?
Yeah, where do you get the money for pamphlets, meetings, whatever?
Exactly. Who has the money? In that system, it's basically high-up government officials. Are they going to fund a movement designed to, get rid of their own power?
Seems unlikely.
He says it strains credulity. Even if the state set up some official office to fund dissent, how could it possibly choose fairly? It just wouldn't work.
Yeah.
You face this all-powerful state.
But in a market economy,
it's totally different. You can raise money from lots of different people. Small contributions add up. You don't need permission from the state.
so you can fund unpopular ideas.
Precisely. It breaks that vicious circle where you need influence to get money, but need money to get influence. The market allows diverse sources of funding for all sorts of ideas, even radical ones.
And he connects this to a real-world case, doesn't he? The Hollywood blacklist.
Yes, after the HUAC hearings in '47, lots of writers, actors, directors were blacklisted for their political beliefs or associations, couldn't get work openly.
Friedman saw that as wrong, right? An unfree act.
Definitely. He saw it as a collusive agreement, using coercion threats, boycotts to stop people from making voluntary deals. Producers wanted to hire these writers, the writers wanted to work, but this group pressure interfered.
But it wasn't totally effective, was it?
And that's his key point. The market made it leaky. Why? Because producers still wanted the best scripts to make money. That commercial incentive was powerful.
So they found ways around it.
Exactly. Hiring writers under pseudonyms. Dalton Trumbo writing as Robert Rich is the famous example, winning an Oscar for The Brave One.
Huh, wow.
The profit motive, the desire to get the best product, created cracks in the blacklist. The existence of a private market meant there were alternative ways to earn a living, even if targeted. It limited the damage.
Okay, so the market can protect freedom in unexpected ways, but he's not saying no government at all.
Oh, absolutely not. He's very clear. Government is essential to freedom, but it's also the biggest threat to freedom because it concentrates power. It's a paradox.
So where is it needed? What's the legitimate role?
Well, first, setting the rules. Defining and enforcing property rights.
Yeah.
Adjudicating disputes.
Like the courts and police.
Yeah. Enforcing contracts people make voluntarily. Protecting people from coercion by others, force, fraud. His line about, "My freedom to swing my fist ends where your kin begins."
Right, classic. What about things like patents?
He includes defining property rights there too, so patents, copyrights. But he adds a caveat. He notes they have costs, they grant monopolies, so they aren't automatically justified just because they're property rights. It's a balance.
And then there's this idea of paternalism, government stepping in because it thinks it knows best.
Yes, he accepts it's necessary for, children or people considered mentally incompetent, those not deemed fully responsible individuals. You have to make decisions for them sometimes.
But not for regular adults.
He finds that deeply problematic. Applying paternalism to competent adults, telling them what's good for them. He sees that as the slippery slope towards collectivism.
So he's very wary of it.
Very. He quotes Dicey, saying it's a path no sane man can decline to enter regarding protecting the vulnerable, but pursuing it too far inevitably clashes with liberty. In those gray areas, it just comes down to judgment and public consensus.
Okay, this leads into a huge part of the book. His critique of government interventions actually achieving their goals.
Yes, this is a central theme. He argues again and again that well-intentioned government programs often have unintended consequences that make things worse, or at least fail to help.
You mentioned he felt experience backed this up.
Right. He felt the initial enthusiasm for things like New Deal programs or using the budget as a balance wheel to smooth out the economy. It just didn't pan out in practice. The results were disappointing, he argued.
What was his issue with using fiscal policy like government spending to fight recessions?
His main critique was timing and politics. He argued spending programs usually get approved too late, after the recession is already ending.
And they stick around.
Exactly. They don't get repealed when the economy recovers, so you just get this ratchet effect. Government grows and grows. Instead of stabilizing things, he thought the federal budget itself often became a source of instability.
So what was his alternative?
A simpler rule. Government should decide what services it wants to provide, set taxes to cover the average cost over time, and then just avoid messing with spending and taxes constantly trying to fine-tune the economy.
And he applies this unintended consequences lens to specific programs too, like public housing.
Yeah, he hits that one hard. Intended to give poor people better homes, reduce crime.
But, he says,
He argues it often made housing worse overall because slum clearance destroyed more units than were built, leading to more crowding. And by concentrating families facing difficulties, he mentions broken families. Specifically, it could actually concentrate social problems, maybe even increasing delinquency nearby.
wow. Okay, what about minimum wage laws? Oh, always a hot topic.
His argument there is pretty stark. He says they primarily hurt the very people they're supposed to help, the lowest skilled workers,
Oh.
by pricing them out of a job. If the minimum wage is, say, $15 an hour, but someone's current skill level only produces $10 an hour of value for an employer, why would the employer hire them at a loss?
So it causes unemployment for the least skilled.
That's his argument. He says the state can mandate a wage, but it can't force someone to hire. And he also points out, maybe cynically, that support often comes from groups trying to protect themselves from competition.
Like unions in richer areas wanting to stop companies from moving to lower wage areas.
Exactly. Northern unions versus Southern competition, for example. He saw protectionism at play.
Okay, one more. Farm price supports, helping struggling farmers.
Same pattern, he argues. The benefits mostly go to the biggest, wealthiest farms because payments are tied to output. The small family farm gets very little.
And it's expensive.
Hugely expensive. He argues the cost to taxpayers and consumers is way more than the actual benefit that ends up with farmers. A lot gets lost in storage costs, administration, benefiting others.
This seems connected to another point he makes about government creating monopolies, sometimes without meaning to.
Absolutely. He sees government action as a major source of monopoly power, restricting that voluntary exchange he values so highly.
Like what kinds of actions?
Tariffs are an obvious one, protecting domestic industries. Specific regulations, he uses the Texas Railroad Commission, setting oil production quotas as an example, calling it feather bedding for the oil industry.
So rules that limit competition.
Right. Even tax laws, he argues, can sometimes favor big established companies over new startups. And he points to special legal protections for labor unions.
And occupational licensing, like for doctors.
Oh yeah, he goes after that hard. He uses the American Medical Association controlling medical school accreditation and state licensing as a prime example.
He thinks they restrict the number of doctors to keep incomes high.
That's his claim. He argues it's a classic case of an industry group controlling entry into its own profession for its own benefit. And he questions whether it even improves average quality, suggesting limiting numbers might actually reduce competition and innovation in medical practice.
Okay, let's shift to maybe his most famous or infamous argument, the Great Depression. He didn't blame capitalism itself, did he?
No, quite the opposite. He put the blame squarely on government failure, specifically the Federal Reserve.
How so? This seems counterintuitive to a lot of people.
It requires understanding the monetary system. He argues the severity of the Depression, the sheer collapse, was caused by a massive contraction in the amount of money circulating in the economy.
How much did it shrink?
By a third between 1929 and 1933. And critically, two-thirds of that drop happened after Britain left the gold standard in late 1931, which put pressure on the U.S.
Okay, why did the money supply shrink? Bank failures.
Exactly. We have a fractional reserve system, right? Banks only hold a little cash against deposits. When people panicked and tried to pull their cash out, bank runs. Banks started failing.
And the Fed.
Friedman argues the Fed had the power to stop it, to inject cash into the system, act as a lender of last resort. But, he says, they basically stood idly by from 1930 onwards as banks collapsed one after another.
Just watched it happen.
Largely, yes. And worse, in late 1931, when gold started flowing out of the U.S., the Fed reacted by raising interest rates sharply, the discount rate.
Which made it harder for banks to borrow.
Yes. It tightened the screws internally, precisely when banks were desperate for liquidity because of the runs. He argues this decision turned a severe recession into an absolute catastrophe.
He felt that strongly about it.
Absolutely. He says it's literally inconceivable. The economy could have collapsed that badly without that huge monetary contraction. His view became very influential, though debated, obviously.
So his solution was what? More active Fed intervention?
No, the opposite, in a way. He distrusted discretionary action. He advocated for a steady, predictable rule. The Fed should just increase the money supply by a fixed percentage each year, say 3–5%, regardless of economic conditions.
If the guests work out.
Right. And internationally, he wanted freely floating exchange rates set by markets, not fixed rates pegged to gold or other currencies, which he saw as unstable and requiring controls that limit freedom.
Okay, completely different topic now. Education. He saw a role for government here, right?
Yes, up to a point. He agreed government could justify requiring a minimum level of schooling for everyone, partly for citizenship. Democracy needs informed voters, and partly because education benefits society generally, not just the student, what he called a neighborhood effect.
And funding it.
He even agreed government could finance basic schooling through taxes or subsidies, again, because of those societal benefits.
But there's a but, isn't there?
The big but is government running the schools. The actual administration. He called this nationalization and strongly opposed it.
Why? What's wrong with public schools in his view?
Lack of competition, mainly. He argued it leads to uniformity, less innovation, less responsiveness to what parents actually want, less diversity in options.
So what was his alternative? This is the voucher idea. Yeah?
Exactly. It was pretty radical back then.
Yeah.
Government requires and finances basic schooling, but gives parents a voucher, a fixed sum per child.
And they can use that voucher where?
At any approved school they choose. Public, private nonprofit, even private for-profit schools.
So competition between schools.
That's the idea. Schools would have to compete for students by offering better quality or different approaches. The government's role would just be setting minimum standards for a school to be approved to accept vouchers.
Did he have any examples of this working?
He pointed to the GI Bill after World War II. Veterans got money for tuition and could choose their own college. It separated the financing from the provision. He even saw the controversial situation of Virginia, where they initially used tuition grants to let students attend private schools to avoid integration. He saw that as a potential, albeit messy, test case for vouchers. He thought it could ultimately lead to more diversity and quality as schools adapted.
Okay, let's move to another really sensitive area, discrimination. How did Friedman approach this?
Yeah, this is definitely one of his more controversial arguments.
Yeah.
He essentially framed discrimination based on things like race or religion as a personal taste.
A taste, like preferring chocolate over vanilla.
Sort of. And his economic argument was that indulging that taste, if it's irrelevant to the job or the product, is costly to the person discriminating.
How is it costly?
Because if you refuse to hire the best person for the job because of their race, you might have to settle for someone less qualified. Or pay more for someone equally qualified who fits your preference. You limit your options.
So the market penalizes discrimination.
That's his argument. The incentive for efficiency and profit pushes businesses away from discrimination based on irrelevant factors. The buyer wants the best bread for the best price. They don't usually care about the baker's religion.
So he thought the market itself was the solution.
He saw it as the most effective force in reducing the harm of discrimination by making it costly and separating economic activity from personal prejudice.
What about anti-discrimination laws then? Like Fair Employment Practices Commissions, FEPC.
He was deeply skeptical of those. His argument was principled but stark. He said if the state has the power to tell someone they cannot discriminate based on race.
Then logically it also has the power to tell them they must discriminate based on race.
Exactly. He pointed to the Nuremberg laws in Nazi Germany as the terrifying endpoint of that logic. If the principle is that the state can control private association based on group identity, then it's just a question of which criteria the state chooses to enforce.
So he saw it as a fundamental threat to freedom.
Yes. He distinguished between preventing positive harm, like using force against someone where government action is justified, and preventing negative harm, like someone refusing to hire you because of their taste, where he thought government intervention reduced overall freedom.
Okay, what about inequality more broadly? How did he view differences in income and wealth?
Primarily, he saw unequal payment according to your contribution or product, not just as fair, but as functionally necessary.
Necessary for what?
For allocating resources efficiently.
Yeah.
Higher pay in one job signals that society values that skill more, drawing people towards it. It's an incentive system that directs effort where it's most needed in a complex economy based on voluntary exchange.
But he also saw another role for inequality, didn't he? Something about freedom.
Yes, another somewhat paradoxical argument. He believed that having pockets of significant private wealth actually supports freedom
Wow.
by creating independent centers of power. Wealthy individuals or foundations can fund things the government or the majority might not like, unpopular ideas, risky new ventures, political dissent. They act as alternative patrons, a check on monolithic state power.
And he also argued capitalism reduced meaningful inequality.
Yeah, by mass production. Things that were once luxuries only for the rich cars, plumbing, communication, travel, become available to almost everyone. He argued this dramatically reduced the real differences in lifestyle compared to earlier eras.
So what did he think about policies specifically designed to reduce inequality, like progressive income taxes?
He was highly critical. He argued they often don't work well in practice because of loopholes and avoidance. Rich people find ways around them.
So they're ineffective.
Largely ineffective at redistribution, in his view, and also wasteful because people spend resources just trying to avoid the tax. Plus, he argued they could stifle the creation of new wealth, protecting established fortunes from competition, because high taxes make it harder for entrepreneurs to accumulate capital quickly.
Okay, so given all these critiques of minimum wages, public housing, farm supports, progressive taxes, how did Friedman think society should help the poor? Did he just say, tough luck?
No, not at all. He explicitly addresses poverty alleviation. His proposal was to scrap the whole complex mess, what he called the rag bag of existing welfare programs.
And replace it with what?
A single, direct cash payment system, essentially a negative income tax.
How would that work?
If your income falls below a certain level, the government doesn't take taxes from you. It actually gives you money to bring your income up. The lower your earnings, the more you'd receive, up to a certain point.
And he thought this would be better.
Much better. He crunched some numbers from 1961. He estimated the total amount spent on all welfare programs back then was huge, $33 billion. He calculated that for less than half that amount, You could have given enough cash directly to everyone in the bottom 20% of households to lift them all up to the minimum income level of the next quintile.
Wow. So much more efficient.
Vastly more efficient, he argued. Less bureaucracy, less waste. And crucially,
It treats people with dignity.
exactly, it treats poor people as responsible individuals who know their own needs best. Instead of having bureaucrats decide they need this specific housing unit or these specific food stamps, you give them cash and let them decide how to spend it.
Makes sense. Did he see any downsides?
The main one he flagged was political. Once you make this kind of direct redistribution explicit,
People might just vote to give themselves more money from taxes on others.
that's the danger. A potential tyranny of the majority, using the system to transfer wealth to themselves. He admitted he didn't really have a foolproof solution to that risk, beyond hoping for the self-restraint and goodwill of the electorate.
Wow. Okay. That was definitely a deep dive. We've covered a huge amount of ground, from capitalism and freedom, Friedman's core link between economic and political liberty, his often sharp critiques of government intervention, those counterintuitive arguments about discrimination and inequality, and then the big proposals like vouchers and the negative income tax. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. But you see that consistent thread, don't you? His deep skepticism about using coercion to achieve social goals versus his faith in voluntary cooperation and individual choice within a framework of law.
Yeah, the focus on incentive, on unintended consequences, looking past the stated goals of a policy to its likely or actual effects.
Absolutely. He really believed that trying to force outcomes often backfires, whereas letting individuals pursue their own values in a free market leads to better results overall, even if imperfectly.
And it's interesting how he revisited these ideas decades later.
Right. In that 2002 preface, he acknowledges some nuances learned, like maybe political freedom isn't always a prerequisite for economic freedom, citing Hong Kong, but still holding firm that economic freedom is essential for political freedom. It shows how these debates evolve, but the core tensions remain.
So, wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway for you listening to this? Thinking about Friedman's arguments, consider this. If he's right, even partly, that economic freedom is a necessary foundation for political and civil freedoms, what does that imply for societies today where economic power seems to be getting more concentrated, whether that's in government hands or maybe in very large corporations? It's definitely something to think about.